get started. And you go. Okay, so our next presentation is personally very interesting to me. How many folks in the room are affected by the New York State DFS laws? Anyone? Okay, great, it's a few of you. How many folks have no idea what the New York State DFS rules are? Awesome. Okay, so again, as a platform, as a group, right, that's exactly what this is about. It's about collaboration, knowledge transfer, communication from experts. If you have something to share in the future, we'd love to hear a topic, so write it on the board. And that's how we sort of plug people in. There is no sort of magic thing. If you have content to share, whether you be a builder of software, a breaker, or a defender, we'd love to have you present at a future event. So please find me, or at least throw your name on the board or a topic, and we'll talk about that at the end. So with that, I think we're going to start sort of a little bit of a panel, right? And is Kazar Sheikh here? I don't see him here yet. I'll try and hunt him down. But we're going to do little intros. If you have questions, please use the mics because it is recorded and it is also a live stream. Also, for the folks that are tweeters, yeah, tweeters is a good word. If you go to the OWASP NYC Twitter account, the live stream is there. We would love for you to retweet it, get more people to look at it. I think we had a few hundred people watching it live, which is kind of cool. So the more people that raise visibility, the better it gets globally. All right, and you guys are good till about 12:15. Okay.
Okay, hi, hi all. My name is Maria Filipakis. I'm currently a managing director at an insurance company here in New York called Global Atlantic. Prior to that, I was in New York State government for about 17 years, first at the New York State Attorney General's office, where I ultimately ran the Securities Bureau, and then most recently, the past 3 years, I was at the New York State Department of Financial Services, where I led the capital markets division, and in that capacity, I led the department's cybersecurity and virtual currency initiatives.
My name is Nicole Becker. I work as a pen tester, forensics incident responder right now, but I used to work for Maria at DFS, and we are going to talk about this reg that we sort of wrote amongst a larger group of very skilled and competent team members. So.
Great. So I think it seemed like there were some people who know about the reg, a few who are affected by it. That is, it just went into effect this March, and others who haven't heard about it kind of want to get an understanding of what it is and, let's say, what New York State's involvement was. So I'll sort of kind of go back 2-3 years just to give you a little bit of a breakdown of how New York got involved, some of the steps that we had taken internally with the team to get to where we are, and then just some sort of broad overview of sort of important provisions, I think, in the regulation. So a couple of years ago, as I said, I was sort of brought on to lead the capital markets division. The division was really tasked with monitoring all sorts of sort of emerging risks and new movements, financial products, whatnot, that were in the financial service marketplace. DFS, Department of Financial Services, is a unique organization in that it regulates all sorts of financial companies that do business in New York, right? They can be licensed, chartered, domiciled here, and it's everything from insurance companies to banks, big banks. It can be sort of smaller community banks. It could be money service businesses, and even more recently, some virtual currency companies. And so what that did was it really gave, I think, the department a very unique perspective, and that you could essentially survey all the institutions that you regulated, be able to kind of collect and aggregate data, ask all sorts of questions, right? Be very interactive with the companies that you regulate, and then really have a horizontal perspective. Unlike a lot of other regulatory agencies, you were able to kind of see what was happening across the financial services spectrum, right? So you could sort of see how are they doing it in the insurance industry versus, you know, what were sort of the new movements and products and whatnot on the banking side, right? And that kind of gave you a really sort of good perspective as a regulator, and a very sort of unique kind of vantage point in that sense. And so we essentially the department put together a team back then, and it was sort of lawyers and non-lawyers. It also included a lot of sort of real technical expertise, like Nicole here, who was really sort of brilliant in assisting us in what we were able to put together. And we decided to sort of survey a lot of the institutions that we regulate. And we put together a bunch of these surveys. We sent it out first in the banking, and they're all on the department's website if you ever want to just take a moment and take a look at them. And it was a real range of questions, from very sort of specific technical ones to corporate governance questions, right, to kind of getting a sense of the cybersecurity preparedness of the institutions on the banking side. And they really sort of did it by looking at the assets under management of a number of these institutions. And like I said, it was, do you have incident response plans, what the relationship of the institution was to their third-party service providers, right? Who was involved in helping prepare a kind of cybersecurity policies and procedures at the institutions? Were the general counsels involved? Were the chief risk officers involved? We were trying to get a sense of how it works internally. And I think the sort of buzzword that you've heard over the past couple of years in the regulatory space has been enterprise risk management. And so we wanted to get a sense of, right, how did it actually truly play out in the institutions we regulate? Who was involved? Was this still considered an IT-centric problem, or did you really get a lot of buy-in sort of across the board? How high up did it go? Was the board involved? Did the C-suite understand some of the issues that the institutions were sort of facing and dealing with on a daily basis? Were they part of information sharing organizations, right? How did what was sort of happening in terms of seeing these breaches sort of consistently occurring day by day affect the budget that was dedicated, I think, to, for these institutions? So we did that, and we found some interesting perspectives. And again, this was now like 2 years ago or so, and I think it's evolving, and you've seen a sort of a lot of movement in the space. But there were some interesting observations in terms of it was still very much kind of considered a sort of IT-focused problem. You saw that.
I apologize.
Oh, sure. No,
Move
go for it.
the mic up a bit.
Okay, great, thanks. Now, we did we followed that up with a survey of the insurance companies. And there, again, it was sort of across the different kind of entities we regulated. So it was everything from property and casualty, right, to health insurers, life insurance companies. And we looked at everything from cyber insurance to what's the state of cybersecurity on the insurance side. And you definitely got to see sort of the differences in terms of preparation and policies and procedures kind of across that spectrum. And then we really focused in on the third-party service providers and did a separate survey on that, and found some really interesting, I think, observations. And I think, if there was anyone here who was present in an earlier panel, what we saw was, depending on the institution, and it always, wasn't always based on the complexity or the size, there were lots of different relationships they had with the third-party service providers in terms of, if there was a breach at the third service provider, did they contact the institution and let them know, right? What were the contractual provisions they had in place? Could they audit the third-party service provider, right? Or the subcontractor of the third-party service provider? What were the reps and warranties in place? And what we saw was, normally a lot of the institutions would also classify or categorize their third-party service providers by the actual kind of service they provided, right? So was it processing claims, settling trades and whatnot? And based on that, they would sort of give it a priority classification, right? High, medium, low, kind of based on what they did. But they weren't always sort of thinking about the kind of things we talked about before, like the Internet of Things, maybe an HVAC, someone who necessarily might rate low in terms of the service they were providing the institution, right? But they had true ability to kind of have access to the network. We also, interestingly, saw that there were sometimes exceptions that were made to the type of contractual representations that you would have with certain third-party service providers. What I mean by that is, there could be a lawyer or an auditor, and there were some instances like that where they didn't necessarily go through complete due diligence for whatever reason. And so sort of based on, I think, these surveys and based on a number of meetings that we had with a lot of relevant stakeholders, so this was something where a lot of work was, I think, dedicated to trying to get it right, to understanding it from a legal, from a corporate governance, from a regulatory, and really from a technical perspective. Spoke to kind of tons of sort of stakeholders, cybersecurity firms, people who were doing pen testing, who kind of came in and really shared a lot of their experience with us. And what we ultimately did was sort of put out a couple of things. One, we revised our cybersecurity exams. So the way that normally works for if you're either advising or if you're a software provider or if you're directly affected by this is usually a regulator will send something that's called a first day letter. And this is essentially notifying the company that you're going to be examined. And the date will be on there, and there'll be sort of a whole host of questions. Because we at the time decided that we're not going to actually really kind of dig a little deeper in terms of the type of questions we asked based on the information and the expertise that the department kind of garnered off of all of these years and these surveys that they had done. They posted these first day letters on their website in advance, which didn't mean that an exam was coming, in a month or a day or so, but it meant that they wanted to give all the institutions an opportunity to take a look at the questions and understand that a lot of the regulators out there are going to be kind of digging deeper and looking at the preparedness of institutions in a lot of different ways, right? So all of this ultimately was folded into a regulation that was drafted by New York State. Again, as I said, it affects many institutions who are doing business in New York across the financial services spectrum. And there was a comment period, which is what happens in regulatory space. You put a regulation out there, you open it up for comments. They received a number of comments. They revised, I think, the regulation based on the comments they got. And the reg went into effect, I think, sort of earlier in the year. And in March, I think, was the date by which there's kind of transition period. So different parts of the reg goes into effect at different times. But some of the basic part just went into effect this past March. So what are some of the requirements that the reg requires? Well, look, some of it has been very tailored to fall in line with NIST. I think one of the issues was that the department really wanted to make sure that they were sort of harmonized with what a lot of the institutions had already begun to kind of put together. So there was lots of discussions with other fellow state and federal regulators. And you'll see, if you ever take a look at it, that the sense of it really, I think, is kind of in accordance with some of the principles that were laid out in the NIST framework. So you've got to have cyber policies and procedures in place, right? You have to have a CISO, and again, for some of the smaller entities, you have the ability to outsource that function, because again, remember the department regulates all sorts of entities. So you might be a smaller institution, may not be able to necessarily afford or be able to kind of get someone with the expertise that's necessary to kind of perform that function. So you can outsource it, but the institution still has accountability for who they bring in. I think a big part of the reg that was revised after that was focused in on risk assessments. So the institution has to do all sorts of risk assessments, right, based on how large they are, what their platform is like, what their core business competencies are. Do they have legacy systems? Are they going to acquire new companies down the line? Are they merging? Are they divesting? And essentially do risk assessments, which are ongoing, real-life assessments. And sort of based on that, these risk assessments they do, there's all sorts of other requirements that flow out of that. And that includes provisions and requirements having sort of basic policies and procedures about how they deal with their third-party service providers, right? It kind of flows into what type of security protocols you have in place. Are you encrypting? Are you encrypting your data in rest? Are you encrypting your data in transit? If not, is there some comparable control function that the institution has in place where you sort of feel that that's sort of the right way to go and why? And there's all sorts of provisions like this that are documented. The department will then sort of, will review these certifications that the institutions have to make. Now, there are some carve-outs, And the carve-outs really have to do with how large institutions are. If you have, I think, fewer than 10 employees, and there's a number based on gross annual revenue, there are certain basic provisions you have to have in place, but you then are exempted from some of the other provisions of the regulation.
Yeah, and a carve-out's like a modification. I feel like just, it's
Oh, okay.
You know.
A carve-out is a modification.
I don't know if that's so clear. I learned that with you, so what a carve-out of a law is, so.
So I don't know if we wanted to open it up to if you all have any questions, or if Nicole, I don't know if you wanted to add any. Yeah, sure, sir.
Do I understand correctly that there are about 3,900 firms that are covered by this? DFS knows who they are, and they know who they are.
I don't know if the exact number is 3,900. I know there's a lot. DFS does know. The department should know who they regulate, and the institutions should know if they're being regulated by the department.
In some industries, it's clear, like a banking license.
Right.
You know, you see them in banks, like they have a little New York State DFS banking license. In others, you know, you should see it. Money transmitters have to have licenses as well, right?
That's right.
They're posted.
That's right. There's money transmitters, check cashers, all sorts of entities. Yeah, yes.
What I'm trying to get is
Right.
a sense of the scale
Right.
of the number of regulated institutions under the reg.
Yeah, I don't know that I can give you the exact number right now. I would go to the website, but
that's
you're right.
ballparks,
It's over 2,000-3,000
Yes.
types of entities.
And less
Correct.
Less than 100,000.
Yes. Yes.
So it's just people on the street.
What do you think of cyber insurance? Do you think that that's something that eventually the government is going to enforce large companies to have? Like when there's these big giant breaches and so many things happen, like how can we hold companies responsible? Do you think that could help?
Yeah, I mean, so I guess when we were doing this, like, you know, as Maria was talking about with like the surveys, insurance companies are also in the business of writing cyber insurance, which is like this, you know, Inception, like, you know, irony going on there. So you had to understand how they were actually underwriting cyber insurance, which also affected how they did their own cybersecurity,
Right.
and there was a lot of bizarre things that we've learned there. But yeah, I mean, cyber insurance is a hot new thing. It's like blockchain, you know, APT, like all these buzzwords. So, you know, do I think it could work? Yeah, I mean, insurance has traditionally sort of mopped up a lot of that residual risk in a market. I mean, the Hartford boiler example is what I always use. These boilers used to blow up all over the streets. And then people were like, we can't live like this. These boilers are exploding all over the streets. So an insurance company sort of raised the standards here with this, like, they would only underwrite boilers if they actually understood we're using the right parts, being well maintained, you know, being well managed. And sort of that raised the bar there, and boilers don't explode anymore. Well, generally they don't explode anymore. I mean, it's a very like basic example, and I don't actually know, like cyber insurance is much more complicated. Like how do you look at risk in any organization is not the same. We all know how it changes.
Right.
It's tough, but if there were underwriting standards that could help inform the actual risk that a company is taking on, like, you know, basic things, like do you patch? I mean, these sound super trivial to us, but when you're dealing with large organizations, it's not so trivial. We learned that last month, right? Do you use multi-factor authentication? Again, you know, we all can click a button and turn it on in Google, it's no problem. But when you're dealing with large federated active directories and, you know, single sign-on things, it's maybe not so simple. But if you sort of raise this bar here and raise, you know, like this minimum standard, you could probably move the needle enough such that companies are being more incentivized to do the right thing because they're able to obtain cheaper cover in the cyber insurance marketplace. It's a very, you know, I'm sure people in the insurance industry would love that, and I'm sure there's a lot of people in the industry that would hate that. So
yeah, I mean, cyber insurance is definitely, you know, one of the hot topics that's being discussed in the insurance space right now, and sort of I agree with everything that Nicole said. You know, one of the, I think, you know, will the government require it? I mean, look, I think you want to make sure that you have a better sense of how it's being underwritten, that the experience is out there. You know, it's very unique in that, right, in all other areas of insurance, by and large, you have all of this experience that you kind of look to, right, to be able to kind of gauge a lot of your underwriting ratios and models on. And I think cyber is something very, very different. You know, I think what you hear a lot of are people not always understanding their cyber coverage. Sometimes many companies not really understanding, right, like where the exclusions are, what the triggers are, and I think there's got to be a better job in making sure that consumers out there, and again, it doesn't matter how sophisticated they are, right? There's many examples where they don't really quite understand what they were covered for and whatnot, and how that was triggered. I think that there's a real sort of need for more experience in this area, both at the brokers and in the insurers, because what you don't want is getting a sense of a bunch of people just kind of checking the appropriate boxes. Do you have this? Do you have that? Right? And then pricing, right? I mean, I think it's the big issue out there is how expensive is this, right? And at the end of the day, you don't want to require it, but have it just be like a false panacea, and then you have it, but it doesn't really cover anything, and the limits are really high, and it's super expensive.
Or companies just decide that they don't have to do anything anymore because they've offloaded all the risk to an insurance company. That's exactly the worst case scenario. And
right.
Nobody wants
that's
at
that
all.
false sense of
Yes.
security that you're not really wanting to promote.
Like, you don't
out
drive
there.
your car like a maniac just because you have car insurance, right? Because you still could die, right? So, yeah.
Right. You may if your parents' car, but still, that's not the point.
Can you talk about the penalties for non-compliance with DFS and entity, a covered entity?
Right.
What happens to both the entity and the individual if they fail to comply?
Yeah, those are lawyer questions, so I'm out.
Well, I think there's an enforceability section in the reg that basically says that all the provisions of the traditional banking law and insurance law are sort of open to the department using. So I think it really does depend. It's a very broad question, and I'm not trying to give a...
So address that.
Oh, okay. Wow. Well, okay. I didn't know that was an everyday problem. Look, I think again, it depends on what the issue is, how directly correlated to the breach that was. Did they do the risk assessment? Who was involved? How senior up in the organization did it go? Who did it affect? I mean, there's all sorts of questions like that, and that would be. And it's not just, I think, the New York department, right? I mean, again, I guess let me sort of take one step back. There's lots of regulators out there that are looking at. The New York State Department is one regulator that put out a regulation, right? But there's all sorts of other regulators, and so if you're in compliance or a lawyer or, again, sort of a software provider, and you're trying to think a little bit about speaking to a regulator or a regulated institution, right? You should, number one, sort of know all the regulators and understand your exposure to the different regulators, right? Because it's being in compliance with a regulation, but you also have all sorts of exams, right, that you are sometimes subject to, right? The SEC can come knocking on your door and take a look at the risk assessments you're making. Are they real risk assessments, right? Are you falsifying them? Were you aware of something just because you did a risk assessment 7 months ago and now you suddenly understand there was a real change at the institution, right? Are you sort of modifying that assessment as you go along? And so, I think it's hard to turn around and say, yup, you're going to pay a $10,000 fine, and this is what's going to happen to you. I think it really does depend. But is the exposure there? Yeah, sure. Especially in the scenario that you laid out.
Hi. I work for a company that provides risk analytics services for banks, hedge funds, and whatnot. Mm-hmm. So hundreds of our clients are impacted by the regulation. Right. And our company, we are certified ISO 27001. We perform SSA E16 audits every year. Yeah. We participate in the ATEC AIMA DDQ, which is a standard questionnaire about your risk posture. But what we've been noticing is that now we have hundreds of different companies, big, small, and whatnot, that are approaching us with different security questionnaires about our posture. Some of them, they understand what we go through every year in terms of certifications, audits, and everything. Some of them are like small hedge funds that they have no clue about security whatsoever. They don't even have like an IT department sometimes. Mm-hmm. And they outsource mm-hmm. their third-party risk assessments to other companies. So we have probably dozens of these small hedge funds that outsourced their third-party risk assessment to other companies. And now I am getting dozens of different questionnaires asking me about my risk and security posture. And instead of like spending my time actually securing and reducing the risk, I'm spending time answering dozens of like different security questionnaires.
Yeah.
Is there anything being thought about standardizing this kind of stuff, or improving these in some way that would not be such a big toll on third-party providers?
Yeah, I mean, it's tough. I think people come at this from different angles, right? Some people come at this from a consumer privacy standpoint, and they're going to ask very different questions than like, is this part of critical infrastructure? That, you know, those are just very different sets of questions. So I guess, you know, in terms of this being standardized, I would imagine that over time this will eventually become much more standardized. There'll be these referential third-party audits that you can use to sort of answer those other questions, like these like certifying bodies, sort of like ISO and SAS and, you know, SOC 2 and things like that. But I just don't think that the risk is so easy to identify so clearly based on all the different people on that stage. So it stinks. I get it. I know where you're at.
Yeah, at the end of the day, I think it kind of like, it's a good attempt of doing something that for smaller firms like mine with not so many resources, you're now spending more resources answering those questions than actually working towards improving the risk posture.
Yeah, I mean, I guess NIST is a little bit trying to do that. You could maybe see if they'll be like, oh, hey, here's my NIST, here's me and my NIST Excel spreadsheet. Is that cool?
Yeah, so we have all that stuff. The problem is like the clients on the other side, when they outsource.
Right. Then you have third parties and third parties and third parties.
And the third parties, sometimes they don't want to say, they have a good enough security and assessment and they have these certifications. Right. Because, you know, they have to show them that they are doing something. Exactly, yeah.
Well, can I ask, is the industry having discussions about this? I mean, have they sort of thought about a way of harmonizing this?
So the discussions I had so far were with my auditors and examiners, and they just mentioned to me that everyone's having the same problem. So.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. Good discussion. So, Nicole, penetration testing. You got like a general schedule? What's best practice on that? Is it something that you do once and done, or every week, or every month, or generally, if there is such a thing?
That's it. You're good. No, I'm just kidding.
Well, I was going to say in the reg, I think after you do a risk assessment, it's an annual, I think at least annual, and then biannual vulnerability.
Or scanning.
Yeah.
I don't know. I mean, you know, we could probably sit here for hours and talk about the value of penetration testing, right? There's the kick the tire penetration test where you're like, all right, cool, I'm ready to go. Let's put that app on the internet. And then there's that ongoing continuous, like, I actually really want to know. I actually don't want anything bad to happen, and I really, really care. So I think a lot of that depends on the psychology of the organization. Some organizations are really, really focused on continuous, you know, testing of applications and their entire infrastructure, and others are just like, hey, listen, you know, my boss read something scary on the internet and now wants a full penetration test, and then it's over, like in 6 weeks, and we all move on. So again, I think like there's no right answer here. I think the right answer is, you know, we all should care about the type of data that we're trying to protect, and we should do the best job that we can to protect that data. So if it involves, you know, an annual penetration test, that's the right answer. If it involves continuous weekly sort of scanning and code reviewing, and as we push code to production, we scan it, and we have our build servers that are always scanning our, you know, what we're pushing, then that's the right answer for your organization. So I think like at the end of the day, it just comes down to people and priorities and what it is you're trying to protect. It's not a great answer, but yeah.
Mm-hmm.
It's not like, hello, Maria, this is the security department. Can we have your password? I mean, is that part of your, I mean, you do from that level on?
Do I say, hey, can I have your password? No, hopefully your pen testers don't walk in and say, hey, can I have your password?
Well, they should.
They should be like, hey, this is your password.
Hi guys, thanks very much. Do the underwriters have a standard that they have to follow at this point in time? Is there a matrix in place?
Yeah, I mean, it's really changing. I think a lot of it depends on there's the carrier side of that, how the insurance carriers see the risk, and then there's how the brokers see the risk, and they all have sort of different ways of gathering the information that they need to perform the underwriting that they actually need to do. So it depends, and it really evolves. You can go I do this a lot. You just reach out to a broker and say, hey, I'm interested in cyber cover, and you're essentially dealing with like a salesperson. So they're very happy to talk to you, and they'll they'll give you a lot of information about what it is that they're looking for to understand, like what they want to know from you in order for them to be able to write this policy. So it's sort of this continuous way of like understanding what they're looking for. But generally, these questionnaires are, how many computers do you have? How many users do you have? How many
So it's not industry specific?
No. I mean, I haven't seen that. If anybody in this room has any other experience, I would love to hear that. But I have not seen, specific, I mean, there is that category question, like what industry are you in? But that doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to get a totally different set of questions, like, oh, hey, you're in, energy and transportation. Therefore, we are going to ask you this set of questions. Versus you're in healthcare, I mean, they do know the data standards, like PHI or HIPAA data standards, or the type of data that you're going to try to, or that you're holding. So sometimes that comes out. But in terms of this overly formal process of like, this is your industry, this is your industry, this is your industry, these are questions, I have not seen that.
On the latest form, I noticed they added, do you store any PII? So I was glad to see that.
Yeah,
they're evolving. There's definitely, it's constantly evolving.
So hi, how's everyone doing? Fun time. I have a question about the enforcement, because if you read through some of the phrasing, you'll see the phrase like, I think in the third party section, must do due diligence XYZ. Then it's like, well, can you actually have an argument with DFS about what do you mean about due diligence? Or there's a phrase like, must use qualified security such and such. Well, then how do you determine if you use qualified security such and such people, whatever? Like there's some, English language quips you can get into if you get approached and say, we don't think you're compliant. Like, well, what does due diligence mean? What does qualified mean? How would that actually work? For those who've actually read the text, anyway.
I think the lawyers are excited about that.
Sure. So if you have specific questions, because obviously I've left DFS and I can't appear before DFS, you should reach out to the department for anybody who has any questions, or sort of speak to your counsel or your compliance officer about very sort of specific things. In terms of, again, I think a lot of it, again, based on much of the commentary they receive, there's a lot that's kind of built into the risk assessments that you're doing for your institution. So every institution is going to be very, very different, or the kind of diligence that you're going to do is, I think, going to be very, very different. It's a lot about what we've sort of spoken to today. You sort of know your institution best, right? So in some ways, I think that getting as much buy-in, and this is kind of across the board, again, not just for the DFS reg, but for really any regulator sort of approaching your institution, it's getting as much buy-in in your organization as possible to make sure that when you're making sort of critical decisions, right, about sort of options that you're going to take or not take, that you've got as much senior buy-in, that you understand all of the sort of data sets, that you kind of understand the kind of information that you're holding, who has access to things, so you can sort of effectively be able to kind of walk through the diligence that you did that's appropriate and kind of tailored to your organization.
But is there situations where it could be like a comparative scenarios, like one of the demos I do for pipeline automation? So yeah, the question I was asking, is there any like a comparative trap? So one of the train demos I do for folks for continuous delivery is you do your build, unit tests, OWASP dependency tests, deploy the app, then Zap hits it, right? That's like a thing that we talk about and we build it all the time. But then if you're a company that's not doing that, if someone approaches the company doing that, where our due diligence for our app is every time a build occurs, all this magic happens, we know the dependency jar that goes into the defect dojo, then you go to somebody else and they are not doing that. Are they now not as due diligent?
Yeah, I mean, so I think when we were, when we were trying to, when we did a lot of the surveys, we tried to bucket the institutions into like categories, right? Like they were like, and we did it a lot by asset size, right? I mean, that was sort of what we were like looking towards. And you can kind of see, like with financial institutions, depending on the asset size, they'll either have all of their own applications or they'll have like they'll have a lot of third-party applications, right, that they use. So you can sort of find this line in which you say like, all right, you're a bank that uses a lot of third-party services. This is what we expect, you know, you sort of like, it moves, right? This is what banks or institutions that use a lot of third-party services look like, versus this is what large banks that build all their own applications look like. So there is referential categorization that goes on a little bit, but it's a soft skill. That's definitely a soft skill.
So I just wanted to, I think I can provide some insight both to the vendor assessment question that was came earlier, and also the insurance regulator.
Okay.
So recently I've worked for two separate consulting companies. One of them, we were very heavy on the third-party assessments that we perform on behalf of people.
Okay.
And we use the shared assessments model there, which was, it's expensive. It's like a $2,000 or $3,000 program a year to be a part of. And basically all they do is provide you a questionnaire of what to ask for. It's about 300 questions and stuff like that. So I definitely think there's a push to standardize it, but there's nothing on the aspect of like OWASP, right, where it's open source. And it's kind of the de facto standard now for application security assessments, which I think would be very helpful, you know, to see in the industry, because I think it would take a lot of the burden off of the vendors to answer, you know, 20 different companies' questionnaires that are all slightly different but relatively the same. And then to build off the insurance underwriters one, so the second consulting company I worked for right after doing the third-party assessments was they were doing a lot of the risk, quote-unquote, risk assessments for the insurance underwriters. That was essentially the same process as the vendor assessment, where we'd send the entity looking for the insurance to fill out a risk questionnaire. And I was surprised to see how that questionnaire was maybe 30 questions, while the vendor assessments typically were up to like 200 or 300 questions. And when I provided some, not pushback, but some guidance to the insurance underwriters saying, hey, maybe we should bulk this up if you want to get a better understanding, a better look at what the risk you're actually underwriting. And from the insurance company standpoint, it was always like, well, we don't want to burden our potential clients, because, well, what's going to say that they're just not going to go to the next guy and get, you know, the insurance companies were more interested about signing the business than they were about understanding the risk they were signing on, I found.
Totally.
So it's kind of interesting. So I heard something new to my experience today, which is about first day letters and examiners.
Yeah.
So can you describe the scenario in which, or how frequently, or how it would work when a company would receive a state examiner relative to Part 500?
You know, again, I don't know that it's standardized. I think one of the things that the department had put out when they put out these sort of newer questions in this revised first day was that they would also do an assessment as to how they examine and whether or not they would sometimes do targeted examinations. So, right, it's everything from when was the last time this entity was examined? Is there some sort of major change in the last couple of years that would warrant another exam? Sometimes exams are often coordinated with other regulators. So in other words, like New York is working with another regulator because, as you know, a lot of institutions, it's really complex, and you might have a number of regulators, right? And sometimes regulators will coordinate their exams. And so I think it really is kind of based on all those factors. When were they last in? Have there been any new changes? And maybe it won't be, like sometimes the cyber, or you'll suddenly get a regulator saying we're going to do a market exam, which is kind of a broader exam, or a safety and soundness examination, right? And there's an IT component. But they may decide, we did that 3 years ago, you know, lots of changes in the cyberspace, we're going to come back into your institution, but it's going to be really focused on cyber. So it'll be more targeted. So it depends.
So just for my understanding,
Yep.
for the audience too, so this
Sure.
is the state sends a person
who comes potentially on site
Yes,
or
yes,
is
I'm sorry,
focused
yes,
and
yes.
creates a
They'll
report.
email you they'll send you these questions, and then the state and or a federal agency will actually appear at your institution, and they will be there for a while. And they usually give you a little bit of lead time so that when they do arrive, you know they're coming, and they're there for some period of time, and they're sometimes at institutions for some period of time.
There was some discussion earlier about penetration testing, and how much does the role of breach and attack simulation capabilities play into the way firms can be more secure? I'm curious if that's even on folks' radar at this point, because it's a fairly new emerging capability space.
Yeah, I mean, I guess from a regulatory standpoint, I don't think that's hit that radar yet. But from a just general best practice standpoint, I mean, I guess testing is sort of part of how a security practice needs to be managed and maintained, right? So any additional testing that people can do to simulate like events and test their incident response capabilities, because that's sort of when the temperature gets hot, people get really emotional, a lot of things could happen there. So if you can sort of test that really well, like continuously or annually or monthly, people are just better at their jobs, and people are better at understanding what's going on. You also find things, right? You could use these things as a way to identify, like, oh, I didn't realize there was like a server sitting out there in that DMZ. We learned that just now. So I mean, those types of things are always good for an organization. And I guess again, it depends on the type of organization. Like it might be too much for smaller groups that have 7 people, but it's definitely not too much for a 3,000 person organization that builds all their own applications. So.
We have time for one more question.
Oh, yep, sure.
So Nicole, how's business? Every stream up, very busy.
Well, it's crowded here, right? So people care. People care about this topic, right? Yeah.
Over here. Yeah. Hi, Maria.
Hi.
And Nicole. So I formerly used to work at Science, so I'm intimately familiar with the survey data. More intimate than I ever wanted to be about survey data, actually. So my question was really the thought process around, did the regulations, when you guys were thinking about the regulations that you wanted to implement, did that drive those survey questions, or was it the other way around? It was something that I was always curious about when I was actually sitting at DFS for 3 months, doing the analytics on the survey data.
I think the question always comes as to whether or not you're going to, any regulator is always thinking, is this a situation where you're going to go down the regulation route or not? But I think very much the department really wanted to understand the issues and understand the industry. And so, and then says really, I think a lot of the discussions and the surveys and the responses and the data, and they're just sort of seeing what was out there, all kind of went sort of hand in hand, and ultimately there's a decision made, okay, we're going to go ahead with the regulation. But it was really kind of, again, kind of based on and very much kind of naturally flowed out of a lot of the work that they had been doing.
That makes me feel better.
Thank you very much for your
Great.
Thank you.
All right. So we are going to do our raffle. I think there's a raffle cup somewhere around here with contact information.